Nobody in the lobby of Vertex Technologies' corporate headquarters that Tuesday morning thought anything unusual was happening. The revolving glass doors spun in a steady rhythm, admitting a stream of badge-swiping professionals in pressed blazers and tailored slacks, carrying artisan coffee cups and leather portfolios, their shoes clicking against imported marble with the purposeful rhythm of people who believed their time was the most valuable thing in any room. The building itself was a monument to ambition, 42 floors of polished glass rising above downtown Chicago's financial district, its facade catching the gray November light and throwing it back in cold, perfect angles. This was the kind of building that announced, without a single word, exactly who belonged inside it and exactly who did not. And standing just outside the main entrance, near the tall potted ficus trees that lined the entrance canopy, was a man who by every visible measure the people streaming past him had been trained to trust he did not belong there at all. His name was Marcus Johnson. He was 38 years old. He was black. He was wearing a delivery driver's uniform. The uniform was neat but unremarkable dark navy jacket with a small embroidered company logo on the left chest, matching trousers, comfortable boots built for long days on hard pavement. He carried nothing in his hands. He stood with his weight evenly distributed, his posture unhurried, his expression calm, in a way that was neither nervous nor aggressive, simply present. The way a man stands when he has learned that stillness is its own form of power, even if the world around him has not yet learned to recognize it. He had a trimmed beard shot through with the first threads of gray at the jaw, and dark eyes that moved at a measured pace across the faces of the people who passed him, not cataloging them with suspicion, but observing them with the quiet focus of someone conducting a very private kind of study. He had been standing there for 22 minutes. He did not appear to find this inconvenient. The first group to notice him was a cluster of junior analysts heading back from an early coffee run, badges still bouncing against their chests from the walk. One of them, a 26-year-old named Tyler, who had joined Vertex 8 months ago and had already begun to model his self-presentation, on the senior directors he most admired, looked at Marcus, and then looked away, then looked back again. "Is he waiting for someone to open a side door?" Tyler murmured, and someone behind him laughed, and the group moved on. 2 women from the marketing department passed and exchanged a glance that carried a full conversation without a syllable. A senior vice president named Gerald Harmon walked by without looking at Marcus at all, which was its own kind of looking. A security guard named Pete stood near the entrance and watched Marcus with the alert neutrality of someone who had not yet decided what category of problem, if any, he was dealing with. Marcus noticed all of it. He said nothing. He waited. The second wave of attention came from a different angle. Somewhere in the building's internal messaging system, a photograph had already begun to circulate. Someone had taken a picture through the lobby glass, catching Marcus in profile, the delivery logo just visible on his jacket, the corporate entrance gleaming behind him. The caption read, "Is this guy waiting for a tip?" By the time the image reached the third internal chat group, the replies had accumulated into a small, ugly pile of laughter. One person wrote that he had probably delivered the wrong package to the wrong address. Another speculated about whether he was hoping to use the executive washroom. The comments accumulated with the relaxed confidence of people who understood, without ever needing to examine it, that they were speaking among their own kind. Nobody flagged the thread. Nobody typed a single word of pushback. The photograph spread. Then Amanda Brooks arrived, and the situation acquired a sharper edge. Amanda was Vertex Technologies' Senior Vice President of Operations, 44 years old. A 15-year veteran of the company who had survived 3 leadership transitions and 2 attempted reorganizations through a combination of genuine strategic talent and an equally genuine ruthlessness about who and what she aligned herself with. She was dressed impeccably, as always. A charcoal blazer over a silk blouse, dark trousers with a precise crease, low heels that were elegant without being decorative. She moved through the lobby the way executives learn to move, when they have spent enough time in lobbies like someone who owns the floor they're walking on, not because they are arrogant exactly, but because the possibility of not owning it has not meaningfully occurred to them in several years. She noticed Marcus through the glass, before she reached the door and paused just long enough to evaluate him, in the way she evaluated everything. Quickly, efficiently, and with a conclusion reached before most people would have finished forming the question. She turned to the receptionist, a young woman named Claire, who had been at Vertex for 11 months, and understood, with the instinct of the professionally vulnerable, exactly how important it was to be seen doing the right thing by the right people. The delivery person outside, Amanda said, not unkindly exactly, but with a precision that carried no room for interpretation. We have VIP clients arriving in about 40 minutes. Make sure he's directed to the service entrance on the south side if he needs to drop anything off. I don't want the main lobby looking like a loading dock. Claire nodded immediately. Amanda moved toward the elevator bank without breaking her stride. Marcus, still outside, had seen the exchange through the glass. He recognized the dynamic he had seen it many times, in many lobbies, in many cities. His expression did not change. He stood still, and he waited, and after a moment, he reached into his jacket pocket and answered a phone call. The voice on the other end of the line was unhurried and familiar. I know, the voice said, with the warmth of genuine amusement. Are they giving you trouble out there? Marcus allowed himself a small smile. Nothing I can't stand, he said quietly. How far out are you? The voice on the phone chuckled. 10 minutes. 12 at most. There's some construction on Wacker. Hold tight. Marcus said he would, and ended the call, and slid the phone back into his pocket. He looked up at the building, all 42 floors of it. Glass and steel and ambition stacked toward a gray sky, and his expression was not resentful, and it was not hungry, and it was not performing patience for an audience. It was simply the face of a man who already knew what the next 2 hours were going to look like, and had decided, long before he arrived that morning, to let them unfold without interference. Inside the building, the photograph in the internal chat had gathered a secondary audience. People were now forwarding it to friends in other departments, with the particular energy that attaches to something that feels harmlessly funny, the shared joke, the brief collective entertainment that passes between people who believe they are all on the same side of something without ever having to name what that side is. A woman in finance added a gif of a confused-looking man. Someone from legal wrote that the guy had serious commitment to the bit, just standing there. The thread grew. Nobody thought to delete it. It lived in the company's own servers, in the company's own communication infrastructure, in the company's own official record of the day's internal communications, and nobody in the thread was thinking about any of that. They were thinking about the joke, and about the Tuesday morning ahead of them, and about their own comfortable position on the right side of that glass. Amanda, for her part, had more substantive things on her mind. She had called a quiet meeting in her office with 2 department heads, Robert Payne, from Finance, and Sandra Okubo, from Human Resources, to discuss what she had been hearing from her network within the board. The CEO, David Hargrove, had tendered his resignation 3 weeks earlier, effective at the end of the quarter. The board had been conducting a search, though the exact nature of that search had been kept unusually close. Amanda had her own candidacy in mind. She had been building a case for it, quietly and methodically, for the better part of 6 months, and she believed not without reason that she had the inside track. She had the tenure. She had the operational knowledge. She had the relationships. What she did not have, and what had begun to fray at the edge of her confidence like a loose thread she couldn't stop noticing, was any clarity on who, exactly, the board had been meeting with in the last 2 weeks. I keep hearing there's an external candidate, she told Robert and Sandra, keeping her voice level and controlled. Someone the chairman brought in personally. Nobody seems to know anything concrete. Robert looked at his coffee. Sandra looked at her hands. Amanda watched both of them and drew her own conclusions. I want to know who it is, she said, before that board meeting this afternoon. She was not asking. She was assigning. Both of them left her office, understanding this clearly. Meanwhile, downstairs and outside, Marcus Johnson stood near the ficus trees and watched a limousine turn off Michigan Avenue and begin the slow approach toward the building's main entrance. He recognized it. He had been in it before, more than once, in other cities and other circumstances. He adjusted the collar of his jacket not nervously, but with the quiet deliberateness of a man who has always known that the way you carry yourself in a room is the first thing a room notices about you, and he prepared, without any visible drama, to walk through those glass doors for the first time. The limousine stopped. The driver came around and opened the rear door, and Richard Coleman stepped out. Richard Coleman was 67 years old, and the founder and chairman of Vertex Technologies, a man who had built the company from a three-person software consulting firm in 1989 into a diversified technology group with operations in 14 countries and revenue that had crossed the $4 billion threshold for the first time the previous fiscal year. He was lean and silver-haired, with the unhurried authority of a man who had long since stopped needing to prove anything to anyone, and whose quiet power expressed itself in things like the way he shook hands, full contact, no rush, eyes direct, the grip of someone who has always understood that attention is the most expensive thing you can give another person. He stepped out of the limousine, looked immediately toward the entrance canopy, and when he spotted Marcus standing by the ficus trees, his face opened into something that was not quite a smile, but was warmer than formality. He walked directly to Marcus. They shook hands, not the quick professional pump of strangers being introduced, but the kind of handshake that carries its own history, a grip held a second longer than convention requires, accompanied by a single word, Marcus. And Marcus said, Richard, and that was the whole of their greeting, and it contained everything. Two people from the lobby's second floor, watching through the glass because the limousine's arrival had drawn eyes in that direction, saw the exchange and felt something shift in their understanding of the situation, though neither of them could have immediately said what it was. One of them, a project manager named Kevin, quietly closed the internal chat thread on his phone and did not reopen it. They walked into the building together, the chairman and the man in the delivery uniform, and the lobby received them in the stunned way that lobbies receive information they were not designed to process. The receptionist Claire looked up and made a sound that was not quite a word. Pete, the security guard, straightened. Several people who had been moving in various directions slowed or stopped. Richard guided Marcus toward the executive elevator bank with the comfortable ease of someone who had planned this specific trajectory in advance, and Marcus walked beside him with the same unhurried stillness he had maintained outside, and the two of them stepped into the elevator and were gone, and the lobby stood in the particular silence that follows a reality adjustment, everyone present recalibrating, and nobody yet sure what they had just recalibrated to. The news reached Amanda Brooks in the form of a text from Sandra Okubo that consisted of 3 words and a question mark. The delivery guy? Amanda read it twice, set her phone face down on her desk, and then picked it up again and typed back, "Find me everything." She opened her laptop, pulled up the company's executive directory, and cross-referenced it with the names she had collected from her network. Nothing. She searched the board's external advisory contacts. A name kept appearing in adjacent searches: Marcus Johnson, management consultant, former chief restructuring officer for 3 Fortune 500 companies, credited with turnaround strategies that had recovered a combined total of nearly $9 billion in corporate value over a 12-year career before an abrupt departure from the public-facing consulting world approximately 4 years ago. His LinkedIn profile had been inactive for 3 years. His last known public appearance was a keynote at a business leadership conference in Atlanta in 2020. There were no recent photographs. The one photograph she found from the conference showed a man in a perfectly tailored suit commanding a stage, looking nothing at all like the man in the delivery uniform she had dismissed through the lobby glass that morning. She looked at it for a long time. Then she closed her laptop and stood up and walked toward the executive floor with the purposeful, controlled stride of a person who has decided that the situation is still recoverable. The file that Amanda had located through 2 hours of increasingly anxious searching was the same file that the board had been reviewing for the past 3 weeks. A comprehensive culture and leadership assessment of Vertex Technologies, internally designated as Project Compass, which had been commissioned by Richard Coleman following a troubling set of findings in the company's annual employee engagement survey. The results had shown a sharp decline in trust scores among non-senior employees, specifically in areas related to how well they felt seen, respected, and fairly evaluated by leadership. The numbers were troubling not because they were catastrophic, but because they had been declining consistently for 3 consecutive years, and Richard Coleman, who had built this company with a genuine belief that its people were its architecture, found the trend personally unacceptable. He had engaged Marcus Johnson through a private arrangement, the details of which were known only to 3 board members and Richard himself. Marcus's assignment had been specific. Observe the actual culture of Vertex Technologies from the inside, at the ground level, over a period of 6 weeks, not as a consultant in a conference room, not through surveys or focus groups, but as an ordinary person, someone without a title, without a badge, without any of the social machinery that causes employees to modify their behavior when they know they're being evaluated. Marcus had agreed to the terms. He had, over the preceding 6 weeks, moved through and around Vertex Technologies in a variety of capacities, including, in the final week, as a contracted delivery driver, making regular runs to the building's loading dock and front entrance, which allowed him to observe the most revealing of all workplace environments. The unguarded moment, the unconscious reaction, the casual interaction between people who believe they are not being watched. What he had documented was thorough, specific, and damning in exactly the places Richard Coleman had feared it might be. The culture of Vertex Technologies, at the operational level, was stratified in a way that had calcified over years of reinforcement. There were people who were treated as fully human within the organization, and there were people who were treated as furniture present, necessary, but not worth genuine attention. The line that separated these 2 groups was not drawn by competence or contribution. It was drawn by title, by appearance, by the invisible social signals that operate in corporate environments with the force of law, even when nobody writes them down. The assessment named specific patterns and specific departments. It identified specific leaders whose behavior had created or sustained those patterns. Amanda Brooks appeared in the document 4 times. Each appearance was accompanied by observed incident data that was factual, sourced, and detailed. Her score, on the Leadership Culture Index that Marcus had developed and applied, placed her in the bottom 7th percentile of Vertex's entire senior leadership cohort. None of this was known to Amanda as she made her way to the executive floor that afternoon, with a prepared argument and a set of objections she had constructed in the preceding 90 minutes. What she knew was that something was wrong, that her position was less secure than she had believed that morning, and that the man in the delivery uniform, who had shaken hands with Richard Coleman in the lobby, was at the center of it. What she intended to do about this was confront it directly, because confrontation was what she was good at, and because she had survived 15 years at Vertex by confronting things before they could confront her. She walked into the executive conference room and found Marcus already seated at the table, along with Richard Coleman, 2 board members she recognized, and the company's general counsel. She sat down across from Marcus. He looked at her with the same calm, observational steadiness he had maintained outside the building that morning, and she felt, for the first time in a long time, genuinely uncertain about what she was reading in someone else's face. "Amanda," Richard said, "thank you for joining us. I believe you've become aware that we have a guest." He gestured toward Marcus. "Marcus Johnson has been working with us in an advisory capacity for the past several weeks. I've asked him to join us for this afternoon's leadership meeting because the board has some findings to share, and because Marcus has a perspective on those findings that I think you'll find directly relevant." Amanda looked at Marcus. She said, "I was under the impression that the CEO selection process was moving toward an internal candidate." She said it cleanly, without accusation, which was a kind of discipline. Richard nodded. "That impression was one of several we were managing carefully," he said, "for reasons that will become clear." He turned to Marcus. "Marcus, why don't you begin?" And Marcus Johnson, who had been sitting quietly through all of this, with the patience of a man who has spent a great deal of his professional life waiting for exactly the right moment, leaned forward and began to speak. He began with the numbers, not the numbers as ammunition, but the numbers as diagnosis, the revenue trends, the margin compression in 3 of Vertex's 4 primary business lines, the talent attrition rate that had climbed 17% over 2 years, and was quietly costing the company more in replacement and onboarding costs, than the board's financial committee had yet computed. He had the figures memorized, and he delivered them without theater, with the matter-of-fact fluency of someone to whom these numbers were not abstract but were instead connected to real decisions and real consequences he had traced back through the organization's structure to their sources. He named the sources. He named the structural decisions. He did not name individuals in that first section. He did not need to. The numbers named everything. Amanda listened. She had intended to interrupt, to challenge, to cross-examine, to perform the kind of skeptical authority that had served her well in 100 meetings before this one. But something in the precision of what Marcus was saying stopped her. He was not wrong. She knew he was not wrong. She had known for 18 months that the margin compression in the Midwest Enterprise Division was accelerating, and she had chosen to present it in board materials as a cyclical headwind rather than a structural problem. Because naming it as a structural problem would have required naming the structural decisions that had created it, several of which were hers. She sat very still and listened and said nothing. Richard Coleman watched her. He had been watching her for most of the past half hour, the way a person watches something they have decided they must see clearly and not look away from. He had known Amanda Brooks for 12 years. He had promoted her twice. He respected her abilities. He had also, for the past 3 weeks, been reading Marcus's assessment of her leadership behavior in careful detail, and the gap between the executive he had believed he was developing and the leader his people were actually experiencing was wide enough to be genuinely painful. "That's only part of what we need to discuss," Richard said, when Marcus had finished the financial section. "The other part is harder, but it's more important. Marcus, the cultural findings." And Marcus opened the assessment document on the conference room screen and walked them through it. He was methodical and he was precise, and he was, throughout all of it, entirely without cruelty. He did not editorialize. He did not perform outrage. He presented the documented patterns, the behaviors, the incidents, the cumulative effect of the way power had been operating at Vertex with the clear, unsparing attention of someone who believes that problems cannot be solved by people who refuse to see them. He presented Amanda's scores. He presented the incident data. He presented it all, and the room was very quiet. Amanda made her move when Marcus paused to take a drink of water. She leaned forward and addressed the board members directly, bypassing both Richard and Marcus as deliberately as she could without being obvious about it. Her voice was steady and controlled, the voice of a professional who has practiced composure under pressure until it has become genuinely real. She said that she respected the work that had been done, that she understood the concerns the board was raising, and that she believed strongly in the direction Vertex needed to take, which was, she argued, a direction that required someone with deep institutional knowledge, established client relationships, and the kind of credibility that came from 15 years of demonstrated commitment to this organization. She said that she was not opposed to cultural improvement, that she had, in fact, been considering a comprehensive leadership development initiative for some time. She said that what she was concerned about was the idea of bringing in someone from outside who did not know the company, did not know its people, and whose understanding of its culture was based on a few weeks of external observation. She did not say the words delivery driver. She did not need to. The implication moved through the room anyway, visible to everyone who was paying attention, which was everyone. Marcus let her finish. He gave her the full courtesy of his complete attention while she spoke, without interrupting, without reacting visibly to the implication, without doing any of the things that would have made her speech easier to dismiss. When she was done, he said, "I understand your concern. I want to address it directly." He paused for exactly a moment. "You're right that I don't have 15 years inside this organization. What I have is 6 weeks of watching it without any of the filters that 15 years inside an organization tends to create. Those are different kinds of knowledge. I'm not suggesting mine is superior. I'm suggesting that the board commissioned this work because they needed the kind of seeing that the people inside couldn't do for themselves. That's not a criticism of anyone in this room. It's a description of how organizations work." The closer you are to something, the harder it becomes to see it clearly. He looked at Amanda directly, not with hostility, but with something more unsettling recognition. The data doesn't tell me what you know about Vertex. It tells me what Vertex's people experience every day. Both of those things matter. But the second one hasn't been visible to the board until now. That's why I'm here. The room was quiet for a long time. Richard Coleman said, I think we've heard what we needed to hear. Let's take a brief recess, and then we'll move to the vote. Amanda stood up. Her chair made a small sound against the floor. She left the room without speaking. In the hallway outside, she stood alone for 2 full minutes, and for the first time in a long time, she did not know what was going to happen next. The announcement was made in the main auditorium on the building's ground floor at 4:45 that afternoon, and the entire company had been asked to attend, which was itself unusual enough to have generated a full day of speculation that had displaced, by mid-afternoon, all other conversation in the building. People stood in clusters, or sat in rows of folding chairs, or found places along the walls, and the auditorium filled with the particular energy of a group of people who know that something important is about to happen, but cannot agree on what it is. The photograph from that morning's internal chat was, by now, something most people in the room had seen, though the thread itself had been quietly archived by IT upon instruction from HR an hour earlier. Several of the people who had contributed to that thread were standing in the auditorium at this moment, and they were not entirely comfortable, though they could not have explained why. Amanda Brooks stood near the front of the room, slightly to the left of the stage. She had maintained her composure throughout the afternoon, with a discipline that cost her more than she let anyone see. She was still under the impression, or she was constructing the impression, as a matter of professional survival, that the vote might have gone her way, that the board might have recognized the weight of her argument about institutional knowledge and internal credibility, that the external candidate with the cryptic history and the delivery uniform might have been a test she had passed by her willingness to confront him. She stood near the front of the room and kept her face neutral and her posture easy and waited for Richard Coleman to walk onto the stage. He did. He was followed, at a measured distance, by 2 board members and the general counsel. The room quieted quickly, the way rooms quiet for Richard Coleman, not from fear, but from the particular respect that attaches to someone whose authority has never needed to announce itself. He looked out over the assembled employees, with the expression of a man who loves what he has built and is worried about it, which was, in fact, exactly what he was feeling. He spoke briefly. He said that the company was at a turning point. He said that the board had spent considerable time examining not just the financial performance of Vertex, but the human infrastructure of the organization, the culture, the leadership, the values that determined how people were treated every day inside these walls. He said that they had commissioned an independent assessment, and that the results of that assessment had informed their selection of the next chief executive of the company. He said that they were confident in their choice. He said that the next CEO of Vertex Technologies understood, from direct experience, what it meant to be underestimated and what it cost an organization when underestimation became culture. He said, "Please welcome the new CEO of Vertex Technologies, Marcus Johnson." The silence that followed was not the silence of a crowd that has not heard it, was the silence of a crowd in the act of revision, of updating, of processing the distance between what they had assumed this morning and what they were being told right now. It lasted for several seconds, which is a long time in a room full of people. Amanda Brooks's face did not change expression, which was itself an expression. The people who had been in the internal chat that morning felt something move through them. Not quite shame, not yet, but the precursor of it, the awareness that something they had done was about to be visible to them in a new light. And then Marcus Johnson walked onto the stage, still wearing the same navy jacket he had worn all day, still carrying himself with the same unhurried stillness, and the room looked at him and revised itself again. The same man, the same posture, the same calm, but now the room understood what it had failed to understand that morning, which was that the calm had never been the calm of a man who didn't know where he stood. It had always been the calm of a man who knew exactly where he stood and had decided it was enough. Several people began to clap. The applause spread. It was not the ecstatic, uniform applause of a room that has received something it wanted. It was the uneven, gradual applause of a room working through something complicated, gathering towards something, some of it real and some of it automatic, and all of it trying to find the right shape. Marcus stood at the podium and waited for it to settle, and when it did, he began to speak. He did not begin with the morning. He did not begin with the photograph or the chat thread or the things that had been said about him in the 8 hours between his arrival at the entrance canopy and this moment on the stage. He did not, at any point in his speech, give those things the dignity of his direct attention. He understood, and this was, Richard Coleman would reflect later, one of the clearest demonstrations of the leadership quality that had made him the right choice, that a leader who begins his tenure with a reckoning focuses the organization's energy on its past. Marcus intended to focus Vertex's energy on what it could become. He talked about organizations the way a doctor talks about a patient, with the combination of honesty about the diagnosis and genuine belief in the possibility of recovery. He said that Vertex Technologies was a company with extraordinary assets, and that the most important of those assets were the people in this room, and the floors above, and the offices he had walked through, and the parking garage, and the mailroom, and the loading dock. He said that every person in this building, at every level of this building, was either contributing to Vertex's value or being prevented from contributing to it, and that the difference between those two outcomes was almost entirely a function of how leadership treated them. He said that the difference between a culture that respects people and a culture that doesn't was not visible in the strategy decks, or the annual reports, or the press releases. It was visible in a lobby at 8:45 in the morning, in the way the people who worked inside a building treated a stranger standing outside it. He let that sentence stand in the room without elaboration. It landed. He spoke about the structural changes he intended to make, the evaluation frameworks, the promotion criteria, the cultural accountability mechanisms, the leadership development program that would begin within 30 days. He was specific. He cited the data from the assessment document. He spoke without notes, which was something several people in the room would mention afterward, not because it was impressive, but because it revealed something about how deeply he had internalized not just the numbers, but what the numbers meant. He was not reciting a plan he had written. He was describing a reality he had already understood. He said, near the end, that he was not interested in punishing anyone, that the patterns the assessment had documented were not the product of individual malice. They were the product of systems that had been allowed to run without accountability, and that the appropriate response to that was not retribution, but redesign. He said that everyone in this room would have the opportunity to be part of that redesign, that everyone in this room had the chance to help build something that they could be genuinely proud of, not just financially successful, but humanly excellent, a place where the quality of your contribution was the only currency that mattered, and where that currency was earned and recognized, regardless of who you were, or where you had come from, or what you had worn to work that morning. There was a moment of total quiet in the room. Then he said, "I'm glad to be here," and stepped back from the podium. The applause this time was different. It was fuller, less qualified, carrying more of the weight that genuine feeling gives to collective expression. Some people in the room were moved in a way they hadn't expected to be moved, by a voice that had described their own daily experience in language they had never heard applied to it by someone at that level of authority. The people who had laughed that morning, or who had stayed quiet while others laughed, which amounted to the same thing, clapped along with everyone else, and some of them clapped harder than they had intended to, because they understood, in the way you understand things that catch you off guard and tell you something true about yourself, that the person they were applauding had already seen them clearly, and had chosen to give them a path forward, instead of a mirror to look into. Amanda Brooks received the call to Richard Coleman's office at 5:15. She had expected it. She sat down across from Richard's desk, and Richard sat across from her, and Marcus Johnson sat at one side of the desk in a chair that Richard had placed there specifically, and the three of them occupied the room in the arrangement that the morning had been building toward since the moment Marcus had first appeared at the entrance canopy. Richard spoke briefly. He reviewed the findings. He said what the board had concluded. He said what the options were. Amanda listened. She had spent the afternoon moving through several chambers of feeling defensiveness, then calculation, then something rawer and less controlled that she had suppressed, and then, in the hour following Marcus's speech, something else entirely, something that she recognized reluctantly as clarity. She had heard Marcus speak about systems without accountability, about cultures that run on unchecked assumptions, about the gap between what leaders intend and what the people below them experience. And she had recognized, with the particular discomfort of a genuinely intelligent person confronting something they have known and not examined, that she had been one of those systems, that her certainty about who belonged in which rooms, about what a leader looked like and moved like and arrived in, had not been convictions she had formed from evidence. They had been assumptions she had inherited and maintained and passed on, and the passage had cost people around her things she had not, until this afternoon, counted or considered the cost of. She said, "When Richard finished, I'd like to hear what the path forward looks like." She said it to Marcus, not to Richard. It was a deliberate choice, and she was aware of it, and she thought that he was probably aware of it too. Marcus looked at her for a moment. He said, "The path forward is a leadership development program that I'll be rolling out company-wide. I want senior leadership participating alongside middle management, not as observers of the process, but as participants in it. It's going to require some real self-examination, and I'm not going to pretend that's comfortable. But I think the people who have the courage to go through it will be significantly more effective leaders on the other side. And I think Vertex needs those people." He paused. "I'm not asking for a decision tonight. I'm asking you to think about it." Amanda looked at him. She thought about the lobby that morning, and the text she had sent about the service entrance, and the photograph she had not originated but had not stopped, and the meeting she had walked into with all her arguments assembled, and the way Marcus had listened to all of those arguments with complete attention, and then had simply continued to be exactly who he was. She thought about the 15 years she had spent building her position in this company, and the things that building had cost people she had never thought to count. She said, "I don't need the night." She said, "I'm in." Richard Coleman said nothing. He simply nodded, the way he had nodded at things he had hoped for but had not been sure of. In the weeks that followed, Vertex Technologies began to change in the way that genuine change happens, not all at once, not through a single dramatic event, but through the accumulation of small decisions made differently, small interactions redirected, small assumptions challenged before they could harden into policy. The Leadership Development Program launched on a Thursday morning and was attended by 63 members of senior and middle leadership, including Amanda Brooks, who sat in the third row and took notes in a legal pad she filled over the course of 2 days with a handwriting that grew increasingly less controlled and increasingly more honest as the program progressed. Marcus established a set of evaluation criteria that replaced the informal, opaque, highly personal processes that had governed promotion and recognition at Vertex for years, and which had operated as the assessment data made clear primarily to reward people who reminded the evaluators of themselves. The new criteria were specific, measurable, and publicly available within the organization. They were not perfect, Marcus said as much when he introduced them, and committed to a quarterly review process that would incorporate feedback from all levels, but they were transparent in a way the previous system had never been. And transparency, Marcus had found, in 15 years of turnaround work, was the single most powerful structural intervention available to a leader who wanted to rebuild trust. He also did something small, in the first week of his tenure, that people talked about for months afterward. He had a standing desk brought to the lobby, not to his office, not to the executive floor, but to the main lobby, on the ground floor, near the entrance canopy and the ficus trees. He worked there for 2 hours every Tuesday and Thursday morning. He answered email, took calls, reviewed documents, had conversations with anyone who approached him, which, in the first week, was almost nobody, because the strangeness of the sight was too disorienting. And then, in the second week, was a handful of people who were curious, and then, in the weeks after that, became a genuine piece of the company's culture, a point of access that no previous Vertex executive had ever offered, and that nobody who had experienced it was willing to see taken away. People who had never spoken to anyone above their direct manager found themselves talking to the CEO. People who had ideas that had never had a channel found one. People who had been invisible found that the act of being visible to a leader changed what they believed about their own position in the organization and what they believed they were capable of doing from it. The lobby on those Tuesday and Thursday mornings looked nothing like it had looked on the morning when Marcus Johnson had stood outside it in a delivery driver's uniform, waiting near the ficus trees, while the people inside made judgments about him that cost them nothing to make and would have cost him everything if he had let them. The same marble floor, the same glass, the same revolving doors. But the air was different. The way air is different in a room where people have decided to pay attention to each other. People walked through the lobby differently on those mornings, a little more slowly, a little more awake, a little more aware that the person beside them might be worth knowing, that the stranger in the unfamiliar uniform might be worth seeing, that the snap judgment formed in the first 5 seconds of seeing someone might be worth pausing for long enough to examine before you let it become a fact. On one of those Tuesday mornings, Marcus arrived at his standing desk to find a note left on it. It was written on a small square of notepaper in careful handwriting, and it said, without any signature, "I was one of the people in that chat. I'm sorry. I'm trying to do better." He read it and folded it and put it in his jacket pocket. He did not know who had written it. He did not need to. He sat down at the desk and opened his laptop and began his day. In the lobby of the company he led, in the building where he had stood outside the glass on a gray November morning and waited with patience that was never passivity, that was, instead, a form of knowledge. The knowledge that what a person is does not depend on whether the room they're standing outside of has yet figured out how to let them in. The measure of a leader is not taken in the boardroom where the vote happens or on the stage where the announcement is made. It is taken in the 1,000 ordinary moments that follow the Tuesday mornings at the standing desk, the leadership meetings where honesty is protected instead of punished, the evaluation conversations where a person is told the truth about their performance in language that is hard, but that leaves the door open, the hallways where people who used to walk with their eyes down begin, gradually and then consistently, to walk with their eyes level. The measure of a leader is taken in what an organization becomes when the leader has decided, as the foundational premise of everything else, that the people doing the work are the work. Marcus Johnson became, in the year that followed his first day at Vertex, one of the most written about corporate leaders in his industry, not because he sought the attention, but because the results of what he was doing became difficult to ignore. Revenue in the 2 declining business lines stabilized within 2 quarters and began growing within 4. Employee attrition dropped by nearly half. Vertex's internal culture scores, which had been declining for 3 consecutive years, reversed in the first annual survey conducted under Marcus's leadership and climbed to the highest levels the company had recorded in 11 years. Several employees who had left the company in the preceding 2 years reached out directly to Marcus or his HR team to discuss returning. Some of them did. The culture had become worth coming back to. Amanda Brooks completed the leadership development program and was retained in a restructured role, smaller in some respects than what she had previously held, and larger in the ways that mattered, because it was built around her genuine strengths, rather than the position she had accumulated. She became, in time, one of the more vocal internal advocates for the new evaluation framework, not because she was performing transformation for an audience, but because she had gone through the process of examining her own assumptions with genuine rigor and had found on the other side of that examination a version of leadership she actually preferred to the one she had practiced before. This is not always how these stories end. In her case, it was. It is worth saying clearly and without sentimentality. She did the work. She earned the result. The ficus trees at the entrance canopy were still there. On a Thursday morning in the following March, Marcus arrived at the lobby earlier than usual and paused for a moment near the trees before going inside. The morning was gray again, and cold, And the entrance to the building looked exactly as it had looked on the November morning when he had stood here in his delivery jacket and watched 100 people walk by without seeing him. He stood in roughly the same spot. He looked at the glass. He looked at the lobby through it, at the marble and the revolving doors, and the receptionist's desk, where Claire was already at her station, 20 minutes before her shift officially started, because she had recently been promoted to lobby operations manager and took the responsibility seriously. She saw him through the glass and waved. He waved back. Then he pushed through the revolving door and walked into the building, and every person he passed in the lobby looked up, and what was in their eyes when they looked up was not the same thing that had been in the eyes of the people who had passed him on that November morning. What was in their eyes now was recognition, not of his title, not of his rank, not of the position he occupied in the organization chart, but of him, specifically, the particular person who showed up every Tuesday and Thursday morning at the standing desk near the entrance, and whose presence in the lobby had taught them, over months of accumulated evidence, that leadership was not a floor you ascended to. It was a quality of attention you chose to practice. Every morning, in whatever lobby you were standing in. He nodded to the security guard. He stopped to ask the woman from accounts payable about her daughter's school play, which she had mentioned the previous week. He picked up a coffee from the cart, near the elevator bank, and thanked the person who poured it by name. Then he got into the elevator and went up to do the work. The most dangerous person in the room is rarely the one who announces themselves the loudest. Rarely the one whose credentials are printed in the largest font on the most prominent badge. Rarely the one who walks in already certain of their reception. The most dangerous person in the room, dangerous to complacency, to assumption, to the comfortable architecture of who matters and who doesn't, is often the one standing quietly outside it, watching, learning, waiting with the unhurried patience of someone who has already decided that what they are does not require anyone else's recognition to be real. You cannot always see them coming. You will not always know what you are looking at. The person you dismiss at the door today might be the person who decides tomorrow what kind of place you get to work in, and what kind of person that place will ask you to become. See people. The full cost of not doing so is almost always paid by someone other than yourself until, one day, with the unsparing precision of consequences, it isn't.